when React came out, I completely and totally discounted it without looking at it at all. It's obviously not smart in hindsight. But, I had built something very similar, and I am sure that if I had looked at it and had looked into it, I would have been probably quite receptive. But instead, people would ask me, oh, should I use React? Like, this new thing came out. What do you think of it? And, people were always asking my opinion on frameworks and systems. So, yeah, I tried to be familiar with things and give people good answers, and I gave people bad answers in this case. And it's something that I sure hope I've learned at this point, now that I'm doing the React podcast and everything. Definitely a big learning experience for me, but I totally discounted it without looking into it or how it worked. Why did I discount it? Well, so the truth is there were many frameworks that were coming out at that time, like I had talked about, and I just thought they were all the same MVC crap, just bad. Like, I looked at a lot of them and tried a lot of them, and I was just like, oh, they're all the same, they're all bad, I don't like them. I basically refused to use them. And so I'm not making excuses. I should have done the right thing and looked into how it worked. But there was another side to this coin too, and that was Facebook. I hated Facebook. I still don't like Facebook. At this point in time, I was already like always trying to evangelize anything other than Facebook. Like, don't use Facebook. And I really didn't like Facebook. I felt I used Facebook in high school, but I quickly, even before I left high school, I thought that the way it was changing human interactions weren't for the better. And so I wasn't excited about seeing it develop. And so that was sort of a fundamental issue I had with Facebook. But much bigger than that, I felt like Facebook always exploited and abused its users. I remember very early on, it did this really sneaky thing where they would try to get you to give them access to your address book or I think it was even your email, I forget, but basically give you access to all of your contacts so that they could contact those people to try to get them to join Facebook, or when they did join Facebook, use that to build up their social network. And in a sense, that's cool technology potentially, but the way they did it was really sneaky. It wasn't like, hey, we want access to this information. This is what we're going to do with it. It was very sneaky. I remember the UI was basically like, you have to do this, even though I don't know if you technically did, but it made you feel like you had to, and it didn't explain what it was. And a lot of people did it and then found out what it was, and they're like, oh, I didn't want to do that. But that was just the start of it. Facebook, in my opinion, did a lot of things, and I think still does, that aren't user focused. And so I thought Facebook was a bad company. And they also had a reputation for poaching good programmers from open source projects and then just them sort of disappearing. So yeah, I really didn't like Facebook. And I think I let that color my opinion a lot about it. I was like, well, it can't be something good if it comes from Facebook because Facebook is so bad. And that was definitely a lesson to me as well. Good things can come from bad places. I'll just, something I've learned is, I think it's important to keep the perspective of where something comes from. It's very important. But at the same time, it can be good. And there is value in looking at things and analyzing things based on their merit. I don't think we should only do it that way. There's a lot of cases where I think ethically you could argue something very good coming from a bad thing shouldn't be used because of where it came from. I don't think React is quite to that point, but I still think it's important to not completely discount where something comes from. But I absolutely shouldn't have been talking about it technically in its merits without understanding what I was talking about. And that's actually my biggest criticism of this documentary, is that I think it paints Facebook in this kind of good light without talking about all of this other stuff. They do touch on the fact that Facebook was poaching good open source engineers and then they weren't really doing things anymore for the community. But other than that, I think this really paints Facebook in a much better light than I think historically it should be. Overall, I really liked the documentary. I do wish they had at least touched on some of the abuses to just put things in perspective. And I know React is the focus of the documentary, but it does talk about Facebook a lot. So to not mention that, I think, is doing a disservice to people and kind of doing a big rewriting of the history to me. And not to necessarily defend myself, I should have still looked into React. I did, I guess, do a small amount, and I do think there was one legit criticism. So yeah, I don't know if you remember this, but early on, and actually for quite a while, React was really bad for accessibility in search engines. It didn't come with a good solution out of the box for any of those. Everyone probably remembers you would just get this white screen initially while you're waiting for it to download all the JavaScript and do the initial render. And there were immediately people trying to make solutions, but they were not very good. And so most people just had the white screen. And I didn't like that. That was bad. That was a bad user experience. And so it was a legit reason not to use React at the time, but not a legit reason to not look into it and look into how it works and be like, oh, wow, this is actually good design. We should take this and make it better. And yeah, it made me sad watching the documentary, because in the documentary, at one point they get to when they were trying to open source it, and how when they first attempted to do so at a conference, it was really badly received. I couldn't help but think, like, oh, if I had just done my own investigation and actually looked into it, I would have been like, oh, this is actually good, and helped them maybe develop it initially, or at least tell people, yeah, it's worth using. But instead, I went for years without even considering it and kind of discouraging people from using it. I could have even learned a lot from it, I think, and applied it to the stuff I was working on, and at least helped steer people in the right direction. So yeah, I think when it comes to technology and programming in general, discounting React initially is one of the biggest mistakes I've ever made. And seeing what the team went through in the documentary when it wasn't initially well received really made me feel bad. Like, yeah, I don't know, I probably wasn't a big part of it, but in a way, I feel like I was a part of almost, potentially killing React. Like, they could have come back from that initial experience and been like, wow, everybody hates it. I guess we'll just keep it to ourselves. And, that's how it's going to be. We could have not had React, and I could have been, in a way, somewhat tiny bit responsible. Not really, but I don't know, a little bit. It makes me feel bad nonetheless. And yeah, so watching this documentary and just being like, wow, yeah, I was a part of that community that didn't respond to it as well as I should have, and it could have killed it. And that could happen with other projects. So it's always a good reminder, I think, to actually look into things before discounting them. I think I'm still justified in being skeptical if a crappy company like Facebook comes out with something. But that doesn't mean it can't be good, and doesn't mean we can't look into it. And if it's truly open source or free Libre software, React is at least open source and MIT license, we can fork it if we need to. It's not the best solution. And so I think it's definitely worth, knowing where something comes from and taking that into account. I shouldn't have discounted React purely because of that. But next we get into some more fun things other than me just being like, yeah, I did a bad job there.